Have you ever felt the cold grip of fear, knowing that the very thing meant to protect you is starting to fail? This is the story of Selene Blackwood, a reclusive witch who once believed her salt circle could keep all evil at bay. But now, something dark has found a way through. Tonight, you will witness what happens when the boundary between safety and terror blurs, when the whispers outside your door begin to sound like they know your name. Selene has lived her entire life in solitude, in a secluded forest cottage far from the eyes of the suspicious townsfolk. For years, her magic kept her safe from those who feared her and from the dark entities lurking in the woods. But recently, something has shifted. The air feels heavier, the shadows longer, and at night, there are whispers just beyond her door. On a night when the moon hid behind thick clouds, Selene sat in her dimly lit cottage, the flames of the hearth flickering against the walls. Her eyes darted towards a window where the darkness outside seemed deeper than usual. The scent of herbs hung in the air, but it could not mask the creeping odor of decay that had begun to seep in uninvited. Suddenly, she heard it, a faint scratching at the door, like claws raking over wood. Her breath caught in her throat. This was no animal. The scratching was deliberate, testing, as if trying to find a way in. She whispered an incantation under her breath, her voice steady, but her hands trembled. She glanced at the salt circle visible through the window, the pale granules glowing faintly under her spell. It was intact, unbroken. And yet, the scratching continued. As the sound grew louder, the whispering began, soft, indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. Selene strained to hear, pressing her ear to the cool wood of the door, and froze. The voices weren't just whispering. They were calling her name, Selene. The sound was layered, many voices speaking as one, filled with malice and mockery. Her heart raced as she backed away, her eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. She could feel the cold sweat trickle down her back, her senses heightened by the overwhelming dread creeping through her. The salt circle was supposed to protect her, to keep the darkness out, but it felt like that protection was waning. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls almost pulsating with the heavy energy pressing in from outside. She felt an instinctual need to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The cottage was her sanctuary, and the forest beyond was an endless sea of shadows, hiding dangers that even she dared not confront. The whispers turned to laughter, low, mocking laughter that echoed through her mind, filling her with a sense of foreboding that she could not shake. Something was out there, something ancient and angry, and it wanted in. Whatever it was, it had begun to find a way through her defenses. If you're curious about what these dark forces are and what they want with Selene, stay with us. Like this video, subscribe, and let's uncover the terrifying secrets that lie just beyond the circle of salt. This is not just a story about a witch. It's a story about the darkness that waits patiently for the smallest crack to appear. It all began with a dream, but it felt too real, too vivid to be the creation of a restless mind. Selene found herself standing in her own cottage, but something was off. The air was thick, almost suffocating, filled with a strange, pungent smell of rot that seemed to ooze from the shadows. The familiar herbs that hung drying from the rafters were withered and blackened, their once vibrant leaves curled and dead. There was a heavy silence, broken only by the faint sound of something dripping, slow, deliberate drops that splashed onto the floorboards. The shadows seemed alive, shifting and curling along the walls, and Selene felt an inexplicable pull, as if the darkness itself was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. The dream took her to the edge of her salt circle, where she could see the forest beyond, dense and obscured by a thick, unnatural fog. It wasn't just fog. It moved like smoke, curling and creeping, carrying whispers that slithered into her ears, filling her mind with a sense of foreboding. Selene took a step closer, her bare feet brushing against the salt, and she shivered. The salt, which had always been her shield, now felt wrong beneath her skin, almost cold, as if it was losing its power. She heard something just beyond the circle, a rustling sound, like dry leaves being disturbed by something crawling through them. Slowly, she bent down, her fingers brushing the granules, and felt a chill pass through her bones. Suddenly, there was a hand, pale and skeletal, that burst through the ground just beyond the salt. It clawed at the air, desperate to find purchase, its nails broken and bleeding as they scraped against the earth. Selene tried to move, tried to scream, but her body refused to respond. The hand was followed by another, and then a head emerged, a gaunt face, eyes hollow and glowing with an unnatural light, staring directly into hers. The figure pulled itself out, dragging its body with agonizing slowness, and began to crawl toward her. Its mouth opened, whispering her name in a voice that was a chorus of agony, filled with rage and suffering. "Selene, you cannot escape." The smell of decay grew stronger, making her gag as the figure drew closer, the salt at her feet beginning to darken and crumble, losing its glow. The boundaries of her protection were failing, and she could feel it. Her sanctuary was no longer safe. The entity's cold, dead eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, she saw her reflection in them, her own face twisted in terror, her lips forming a silent plea for help. The fear gripped her, paralyzing her as the figure reached out, its fingers brushing against her ankle. A jolt of cold shot through her leg, and finally, she screamed, a sound that shattered the silence, echoing in the dark. Then, she woke up, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding like a war drum in her chest. But the fear didn't fade. The room still felt wrong. The air was too cold, the scent of rot still faintly present. She looked towards the salt circle, and in the dim light of the early dawn, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A trail of blackened, decayed salt ran along the edge of the circle, as if something had tried, and nearly succeeded, in breaking through. The fear from the dream lingered, a chilling reminder that whatever was out there wasn't confined to her nightmares. The boundary was weakening, and the darkness was closer than ever before. The following nights became a blur of unease, each one more oppressive than the last. Selene couldn't shake the feeling that her dream had not ended. It had merely bled into her waking hours. The whispers returned every evening, a cacophony that grew louder as the darkness deepened outside her cottage. The salt circle, once brilliant and pure, had started to lose its power. The white granules slowly turned a sickly gray, and strange, dark veins began to snake through the salt, as if something corrupt was reaching out to claim it. It was no longer a barrier, it was becoming a gateway. The line between safety and danger had blurred. One particular night, as a cold wind howled through the trees, Selene heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was not at the door but along the windows, the glass vibrating as if something sharp and determined was testing its strength. Her candlelight flickered, casting fleeting shadows that danced across the room, each twist and curl seeming to take on a life of its own. Selene's pulse quickened, her gaze drawn to the window. She could just barely make out a silhouette standing beyond the glass, its form shifting as though it were not fully real, not entirely of this world. Slowly, she approached the window, her footsteps muffled by the thick, anxious silence of the cottage. The figure stood motionless, its face obscured by darkness, but the sense of hatred and desperation radiating from it was palpable. As she drew closer, the whispering resumed, low and rhythmic, an almost hypnotic chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The glass began to frost over, a thin layer of ice creeping from the edges, forming jagged patterns that resembled skeletal fingers. Selene could barely breathe as her hand reached out, almost involuntarily, towards the icy surface, her fingertips hovering inches from the glass. Suddenly, the frost twisted into words, her name, scrawled across the window in jagged, almost frantic script. Selene jerked her hand back, her heart leaping into her throat. Her instincts screamed for her to step back, to retreat into the warmth of her magic, but something else, a twisted curiosity, perhaps, kept her rooted in place. She watched horrified as the frost continued to etch new symbols. Symbols she recognized from the old books, dark sigils meant to summon or bind spirits. Her breath fogged the window as she whispered a protective incantation, her voice trembling with fear. And then she saw it, a movement in the reflection. Behind her, in the shadows of her own home, something shifted. The air turned icy, and the smell of decay filled her nostrils once more, stronger than ever, making her gag. Slowly, she turned, her eyes straining to see in the dim candlelight. The shadows seemed thicker, darker, and she could feel something there, something watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Her eyes caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of white that vanished as soon as she turned fully. Her heart hammered as she moved back from the window, the whispers now filling her ears, drowning out her thoughts. She stumbled towards a hearth, grabbing a bundle of dried sage, her fingers fumbling as she tried to light it. The flame sputtered and died, the wick refusing to catch, as if the very air had been drained of warmth and life. Panic began to rise, choking her as she felt an unseen presence press closer, the weight of countless eyes on her. She whispered desperate words of power, her voice cracking under the strain. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a face emerging from the shadows, pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow, glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light. It grinned, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of blackened teeth. Selene's knees went weak, and she fell back against the wall, her mind racing. She knew it was them, the spirits from her past, the ones who had come for retribution. They had found her. They were breaking through. As the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, she felt herself slipping, her vision darkening as the world seemed to close in, her home transformed into a prison with no escape. The shadows moved, encircling her, their forms solidifying, their fingers reaching. Selene gasped, her back against the cold wall, as the darkness seemed to breathe around her, alive and malevolent. They were closer now, and she realized, with a chilling certainty, that the salt had failed. Not just the circle around her home, but the salt in her spirit, the strength she had once possessed to keep the darkness at bay. And as the last of the candlelight flickered and died, Selene was left alone in the pitch black of her cottage, surrounded by the ghosts of her past, each whispering her name with a hunger that promised there would be no mercy. The cold night swallowed her screams as Selene found herself trapped in an overwhelming darkness that seemed to reach out with tendrils of malice. She was no longer in her cottage. She stood somewhere else, somewhere twisted and unnatural, yet familiar, like a nightmare version of her home. The walls of the room seemed to shift and breathe, the wood blackened, and the air suffused with the rancid odor of decay, stronger than ever before. She felt the floor beneath her feet pulsate, as if the entire structure was a living, grotesque entity. Selene's heart pounded in her chest, her breathing ragged, each inhalation filled with the stench of rot and something far more sinister. Her eyes adjusted to the dim, oppressive light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Before her, the salt circle, so essential, so sacred, lay shattered, the once pristine granules scattered and darkened. Beyond it, the shadows writhed, a mass of undulating blackness filled with faint, glowing eyes that watched her hungrily. It was then she noticed the whispers had stopped, replaced by something far more horrifying, a silence so deep it seemed to press against her eardrums, as though the world itself held its breath, waiting for something dreadful to happen. And then, out of the silence, a figure began to form. It emerged from the shadows with agonizing slowness, as if savoring the moment. Selene could barely see its features, but the outline was unmistakable. A tall, skeletal figure, draped in tattered black, with eyes that burned with a malicious light. It seemed to glide toward her, its bony fingers outstretched, reaching for her. She tried to back away, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, her body unresponsive, frozen by an unseen force. Fear clawed at her chest, her instincts screaming for her to run, but there was no escape. As the figure drew closer, Selene's surroundings shifted, a disorienting swirl of shadows and light. She blinked, and suddenly, she was no longer alone. Around her stood the others, the ghosts of her past. Their faces were twisted in expressions of pain and rage, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The young girl, the first victim of Selene's mistakes, stood at the forefront, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to speak. No words came out, only a gurgling, choking sound that filled Selene with an icy dread. She could feel their anger, their suffering, and she knew they had come to drag her into the darkness with them. The skeletal figure, now standing within the broken salt circle, spoke without words, its voice echoing in her mind, a cruel, mocking tone that resonated with her deepest fears. "You took from us, Selene. You thought you could hide." Its bony hand reached out, the fingers brushing against her cheek, and she felt a cold like nothing she had ever experienced, a chill that seemed to seep into her very soul, freezing her from the inside out. Her vision blurred, her surroundings growing darker, and she realized she was slipping away, being pulled into whatever twisted realm these spirits inhabited. Desperate, Selene fought against the pull, her mind racing. She remembered the seer's words. The circle had lost its power because it was built on lies. The only way to strengthen it was to face the truth, to confront her past, no matter how painful. With a surge of determination, she forced herself to look into the hollow eyes of the girl before her, to see her pain, to acknowledge her suffering. Tears welled in Selene's eyes as she whispered, "I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this." The words fell hollow, but they were all she had. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The cold lessened, and the skeletal figure hesitated, its grip loosening. The spirits around her flickered, their forms wavering as though caught between two worlds. Selene felt a sliver of hope. Perhaps she could end this. Perhaps she could make amends. But then, a sharp pain shot through her, and she gasped, her hands clutching her chest. The skeletal figure had not let go. Instead, its fingers had pierced her, a searing cold spreading through her body, the hope she had felt slipping away like sand through her fingers. With a sudden, violent jolt, Selene was back in her cottage, the familiar walls around her once more. She fell to her knees, gasping for breath, her heart pounding wildly. The air was still icy, the scent of decay still lingering, and she knew that this was not over. The shadows were gone, but something had been left behind, a mark, a reminder of the darkness that had touched her. Her hand moved to her chest, and she felt it, a patch of skin, cold and numb, a sign that the spirits had left their mark on her, that they were still with her waiting. The salt circle lay broken at her feet, its power shattered. Selene knew that the boundary had been breached, that the darkness had found a way in. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder, filling the silence with their insidious chant. And as she looked around her dimly lit cottage, she realized that the line between her nightmares and reality had finally dissolved. Whatever had been beyond the circle was now inside, and she was no longer safe, not from them, and not from herself. The morning came, but it brought no comfort. Selene rose from the cold, hard floor, her body aching, her chest still numb where the entity had touched her. The cottage was eerily silent, the air thick with an unnatural chill that refused to dissipate. She knew she had to examine the salt circle, had to see the damage that had been done. The sense of dread grew with every step she took toward the door, her bare feet leaving imprints on the dusty floorboards, as if marking a path to the unknown. When she reached the threshold, the sight that met her eyes turned her stomach. The once white line of salt that surrounded her cottage was no longer there. Instead, a thin, dark trail snaked its way across the ground, the granules tainted with an inky blackness that seemed to pulse and writhe, almost alive. It looked as if something corrosive had spilled, eating away at her only barrier. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as she touched the salt. The instant she made contact, a jolt shot through her. Images flashed in her mind, chaotic and disjointed. She saw faces, people from her past. Some she had known only briefly, others whose names she could no longer remember. Their eyes were hollow, filled with a deep, burning hatred. They whispered her name, their voices overlapping, growing louder until they became screams. The vision ended abruptly, leaving her gasping, her hand jerking away from the salt as if it had burned her. There was no denying it now. This was no ordinary dream. The spirits were real, and they had crossed the threshold into her world. The nightmares had become reality, and the boundaries between them had shattered. Determined to find answers, Selene began to search her cottage, her eyes scanning every corner, her senses heightened. There had to be something she missed, some clue that explained why the spirits had found her now, after all these years. She opened a drawer, pulling out old scrolls and tattered books, their pages yellowed with age. As she sifted through them, her gaze fell upon a journal, her grandmother's, bound in worn, cracked leather. It was a book she had rarely dared to open, filled with dark spells and forbidden knowledge. But now, she had no choice. Flipping through the pages, Selene found entries that spoke of protection, of barriers created from salt and bone, magic woven with intention and sacrifice. And there, in faded ink, she found a passage that made her blood run cold. Her grandmother had written about the dangers of incomplete protection, that a circle drawn without true remorse for past actions could only serve as a temporary shield. The darkness would always find a way in, drawn to the lies and guilt of the caster. The realization hit her like a blow. Her circle had failed because she had failed. She had never faced the consequences of her actions, never truly understood the weight of the spirits she had bound. Suddenly, a soft noise echoed through the room, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor. Selene's eyes snapped up, her heart leaping into her throat. Across the room, the shadows shifted, and for a brief moment, she saw something, a figure barely visible, standing just beyond the reach of the morning light that filtered through the window. It was the young girl, her eyes dark and empty, her mouth twisted into a sorrowful, accusing frown. Selene's breath caught, her fingers gripping the edge of the journal so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to speak, to explain herself, but no words came. The girl raised a hand, pointing towards a hearth, her movements slow and deliberate. Selene's gaze followed, her eyes falling on the old iron cauldron that hung there. Her heart sank as she remembered the cauldron where she had once brewed a potion intended to bind the spirits of the restless. She had believed it was harmless, a mere precaution against the energies she didn't understand. But now, looking at the cauldron, she felt the weight of her actions, the arrogance, the ignorance. The whispers returned, growing louder, echoing through the cottage, a chorus of voices filled with anguish and rage. Selene moved toward the hearth, her legs trembling, her mind racing. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the cauldron, and immediately a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the small flame that had been burning. The shadows deepened, and she could feel them closing in, the air thick with their presence. She knew what she had to do. She had to unbind them, to release the spirits she had wronged. But the thought terrified her. What if they refused to forgive her? What if, once freed, they chose to take their revenge? She took a deep breath, her eyes closing as she whispered an incantation, a plea for forgiveness, a promise to right her wrongs. The air seemed to pulse around her, the temperature dropping even further. When she opened her eyes, the young girl was gone, but the sense of being watched remained. The whispers subsided, replaced by a heavy silence, a silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Selene knew this was only the beginning. The spirits had given her a chance, but it was not a reprieve. They were waiting, watching, and if she failed, they would return, stronger and more relentless than before. As she looked around her cottage, now bathed in the dim light of a sun that could not seem to penetrate the gloom. Selene understood the truth. The line between the living and the dead had been crossed, and the darkness had found a foothold in her world. There was no escaping it, only confronting it or being consumed by it. Selene could no longer stay confined within the decaying walls of her cottage, haunted by shadows that knew her every sin. She had to seek answers. Something or someone who could tell her how to put an end to the nightmare that had found its way into her life. The forest beyond her home, which had once seemed a peaceful refuge, now felt menacing, each tree a towering figure that loomed over her, its branches twisted like skeletal fingers reaching out to ensnare her. The air was heavy with mist, and the path before her was barely visible, swallowed by the thick fog that clung to the ground like a creeping curse. As Selene stepped out of her broken circle of salt, a shiver ran down her spine. She could feel eyes on her, unseen entities watching her every move, lurking just beyond the veil of mist. Every step she took seemed to echo in the stillness, a reminder of how utterly alone she was in this twisted journey. The whispers followed her, now softer, more insidious, their tone laced with a dark amusement that made her skin crawl. She tightened her grip on the old leather journal, her only guide to the dangerous magic that had brought her to this point, and forced herself to move forward, deeper into the forest. Her destination was a place she had long feared, the dwelling of an ancient hermit, a seer rumored to know the secrets of life, death, and the worlds beyond. Few dared to approach him, for his price was often more than one could bear. But Selene was desperate. The deeper she went, the darker the forest became, the canopy above blocking out the sun until it felt as if night had already fallen. Shapes moved between the trees, shadows that seemed to shift and dart just out of her line of sight, and she could feel them getting closer, their presence a cold chill against her skin. After what felt like hours, she reached a clearing. There, in the center, stood a small hut, made of gnarled wood and draped in thick green moss. It seemed almost a part of the forest itself, as if it had grown out of the earth, a natural extension of the dark and twisted land around it. The door was ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, carrying with it the acrid scent of burnt herbs. Selene hesitated, her heart pounding, the whispers now replaced by a deep, oppressive silence that seemed to urge her to turn back. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped forward, the wooden boards of the porch groaning beneath her weight. She pushed the door open, and it swung inward with a drawn-out creak. The interior was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of embers in a fireplace. The air was thick with smoke and an indescribable sense of age, as if the very walls held memories of countless sorrows. And there, in the shadows, she saw him, the hermit. His face was obscured by the hood of his cloak, but she could feel his gaze on her, a heavy, knowing look that seemed to pierce straight through her. "You come seeking answers," his voice rasped, a sound like dried leaves rustling in the wind. Selene nodded, her mouth, too, dry to form words. He gestured for her to sit, his bony hand emerging from beneath the cloak, and she obeyed, lowering herself onto a worn, wooden stool. The hermit moved closer, and as he did, she caught sight of his eyes, dark and hollow, as if they contained the abyss itself. "The spirits that haunt you," he continued, "are not mere phantoms. They are the echoes of your own wrongdoings, bound by the lies you've told yourself." Selene shivered, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She opened the journal, her fingers trembling as she flipped to the page that spoke of binding and sacrifice. "How do I make it right?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the dying fire. The hermit let out a low, almost mocking laugh, the sound filling the small space with a sense of dread. "You cannot undo what has been done," he said, his tone cold and final. "But you can appease them. To do so, you must give them what they seek, retribution, or a part of yourself." The room seemed to grow colder, the fire flickering as if struggling to stay alight. Selene's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. A part of myself, she repeated, her voice breaking. The hermit nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. The darkness will not leave you until it is fed. You must make a choice. Surrender to them, offer your soul as penance, or find another to take your place. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and Selene felt her stomach twist with fear and revulsion. Could she truly sacrifice someone else to save herself? The thought alone made her feel sick, yet the alternative was unthinkable. The hermit reached into the folds of his cloak, pulling out a small vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. "This will help you see," he said, placing it on the table before her. "It will reveal the truth of what binds them to you and guide you to the choice you must make." Selene stared at the vial, the liquid inside swirling as if alive, a deep, inky black that seemed to absorb all light. Her hand shook as she reached for it, the cold glass sending a shiver through her fingers. The hermit stepped back, his form fading into the shadows once more. "Choose wisely," which, he said, his voice echoing in the darkness. "For once the path is taken, there can be no turning back." With the vial in her hand, Selene stood, her legs weak, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. She turned and left the hut, the door creaking shut behind her, the forest once more enveloping her in its cold embrace. The whispers returned, louder now, almost eager, as if they knew she was one step closer to making her decision. The fog thickened, and she could feel the presence of the spirits growing stronger, their forms darting between the trees, always just out of reach, but never far from her. As she walked back toward her cottage, Selene realized that the darkness was no longer just around her. It was inside her, a part of her very being. And as the whispers grew louder, filling her mind with their insistent chant, she knew that the journey was far from over. The real battle had only just begun, and the choice she faced would determine not only her fate, but the fate of all those who had been drawn into her web of lies and dark magic. There was no escaping the past, no running from the shadows. There was only the darkness, and the question of whether she had the strength to confront it, or whether it would consume her entirely. The night had fallen like a suffocating shroud by the time Selene returned to her cottage. The forest had seemed endless on her journey back, every path appearing unfamiliar, twisted by shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. Her heart pounded with each step, and the whispers that had once been faint had now become an ever-present chorus, voices filled with rage, longing, and mockery. They knew what she had learned, they knew the choice she faced, and they taunted her with every breath. The vial she had received from the hermit was cold in her hand, its darkness a promise of both revelation and damnation. As she crossed the threshold of her home, Selene could feel it, an oppressive presence, thick in the air, pressing in on her from all sides. The cottage was darker than usual, the shadows seemingly alive, shifting in unnatural ways. The fire in the hearth had gone out, leaving the room in an eerie half-light that flickered and twisted, as if reality itself was struggling to hold. She moved to the center of the room, her eyes drawn to the remnants of the broken salt circle. The blackened granules lay scattered, and from the darkened patches, thin tendrils of shadow seemed to coil and writhe, like a serpent preparing to strike. She knew what had to be done. There was no escaping it, no avoiding the confrontation. Taking a deep breath, Selene uncorked the vial, the liquid inside swirling as if alive. The smell of decay wafted up, making her stomach churn, and she hesitated, her hand trembling. Then, with a steadying exhale, she brought the vial to her lips and drank. The taste was bitter, cold, like swallowing the essence of darkness itself. It coated her throat, spreading through her chest like ice, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to blur, the shadows growing thicker, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. Suddenly, the world shifted. The floor beneath her feet seemed to vanish, and Selene found herself standing in a place that was not her cottage, yet looked eerily similar. It was her home, but twisted, distorted, an uncanny replica, where the walls seemed to breathe, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of mist that coiled around her ankles. The air was cold, and the only light came from a flickering candle that cast long, wavering shadows across the walls. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence that made her ears ring, a silence that felt like it was waiting for something. From the darkness, they emerged. The spirits, their forms barely more than outlines, began to materialize around her, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The young girl stood at the forefront, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with a sorrow that cut through Selene like a knife. Behind her were others, men, women, their faces twisted with pain, their bodies marred by the effects of the magic that had bound them. They surrounded her, their presence heavy and cold, and Selene could feel their hatred, their anger, their unending hunger for retribution. The skeletal figure from her dreams stepped forward, its tattered robes trailing across the mist-covered floor, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. "Selene," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind, a chorus of agony and rage. "You have taken from us. You have stolen what was ours, and now we have come to claim what is owed." The figure raised its hand, the bony fingers reaching out, and Selene felt the cold begin to seep into her once more, a chill that went beyond the physical, that touched her very soul. Tears filled her eyes, and she fell to her knees, her hands pressed against the mist-covered floor. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for this. I thought I could control it. I thought I was doing the right thing." The skeletal figure paused, its head tilting slightly, as if considering her words. The other spirits remained silent, their eyes fixed on her, unblinking, waiting. Selene knew that apologies would not be enough. She had taken their lives, bound their souls to her magic, and now she had to make it right. The hermit's words echoed in her mind. "Surrender to them, offer your soul as penance, or find another to take your place." The weight of those words pressed down on her, a choice that seemed impossible. To offer herself would mean an eternity in darkness, her soul bound to the very spirits she had wronged. But to find another, to sacrifice an innocent to save herself, was unthinkable. The shadows pressed closer, the cold intensifying, the spirit's eyes boring into her, demanding an answer. With a shuddering breath, Selene raised her head, her eyes meeting those of the young girl. "Take me," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "Take my soul, and let this end." The skeletal figure's eyes seemed to glow, and for a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, the spirits moved, their forms shifting, closing in around her. The cold was unbearable, a darkness that seemed to seep into every part of her, and Selene closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She could feel them, their hands on her, pulling her into the abyss, their whispers now a chorus of satisfaction. But then, something changed. The cold began to lessen, the grip of the spirits loosening. Selene opened her eyes, and what she saw made her heart stop. The young girl was standing before her, her face no longer twisted in anger, but filled with a strange, sorrowful kindness. The other spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist, and the skeletal figure lowered its hand, its gaze softening. The young girl reached out, her fingers brushing against Selene's cheek, and for a brief moment, warmth spread through her, a warmth that spoke of forgiveness, of release. The spirits began to vanish, one by one, their forms dissipating into the shadows, until only the young girl remained. She looked at Selene, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed too deep for words, and then she too was gone, leaving behind only the faint echo of her voice. "Find peace," she whispered, and then there was silence. Selene found herself back in her cottage, the floor solid beneath her, the air no longer cold. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced, and the salt circle lay unbroken once more. But as she looked around, Selene knew that the darkness had not left her completely. It had touched her, left its mark on her, and though the spirits were gone, she could still feel the weight of her actions, the choices she had made. The vial lay empty on the floor, its contents spent, and Selene knew that her journey was not over. The darkness had been appeased, but it was still there, waiting, watching. And as she looked into the flickering light of the hearth, Selene understood that she would always be walking the line between light and shadow, between life and death, haunted by the ghosts of her past and the choices she had yet to make. The dim light of dawn filtered through the narrow windows of Selene's cottage, bathing the room in a pale, uncertain glow. The air was still and heavy, as if the entire forest held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. Selene stood in the center of her cottage, her gaze fixed on the now unbroken salt circle that surrounded her. The remnants of her ordeal lingered in every shadow, the echo of whispers still barely audible, as if they resided just beyond the veil of her reality, always waiting to return. Though the spirits had been appeased, Selene knew in her heart that she had not seen the last of them. As she looked around, everything seemed different. The walls of her home, once her sanctuary, now seemed like a fragile barrier against an infinite darkness. The sense of security she once took for granted was gone, replaced by an uneasy stillness that seemed ready to unravel at any moment. The mark left by the skeletal figure, cold and dark upon her chest, throbbed faintly, a reminder that she was forever bound to what she had unleashed. It wasn't just a scar. It was a connection, a door left ajar between her world and the unknown beyond. Selene moved slowly, her fingers brushing over the worn leather of her grandmother's journal, which lay open on the table. The pages were blank, their writings faded away, as if the knowledge contained within had served its purpose and was now lost to her. A chill swept through the room, and she turned, her eyes narrowing at the shadows that lingered in the corners, thicker than they should have been, their edges moving subtly, as if alive. They watched her, just as the spirits had, and she knew they were waiting for the moment she would falter, the moment they could return. She walked to the window, her eyes scanning the forest beyond. The mist still hung heavy between the trees, obscuring everything more than a few feet away. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure, a silhouette standing in the fog, watching her cottage. But when she blinked, it was gone, leaving only the swaying branches and the whisper of the wind. The forest, once her refuge, was now a place of uncertainty, its depths hiding secrets that she could never hope to fully comprehend. Somewhere out there, the line between the living and the dead had been crossed, and it could happen again. Selene took a deep breath, her hands clenching at her sides. She had survived the night, but the cost was heavy, and the future seemed darker than ever. The spirits had given her a chance, but she had no illusions. It was not out of mercy, but because they knew she was still bound to them, still vulnerable to the darkness they represented. They had let her go for now, but they had left their mark upon her, and Selene understood that they could return whenever they wished. The salt circle could hold them back, but only for so long, and the knowledge of what she had done could never truly be forgotten. A soft noise broke the silence, a faint rustling from the far corner of the room. Selene's heart skipped a beat, her head snapping in the direction of the sound. There, in the shadows, she saw it, a faint movement, as if something shifted just out of sight. Her pulse quickened, the air thickening once more, the sensation of being watched returning with a suffocating intensity. She stepped closer, her eyes straining in the dim light, but the corner remained empty, the shadows unmoving. Was it her imagination, or had the darkness already begun to creep back in? The uncertainty gnawed at her, and she turned away, her gaze falling upon the empty vial that lay discarded on the floor. Its once dark liquid was gone, but the memory of the bitterness lingered on her tongue, a reminder of the price she had paid for the truth. She reached down, picking it up, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. She knew that she could not simply stay here, could not just wait for the darkness to take her again. There had to be another way, some way to protect herself, to ensure that the spirits could not return. But the question remained, what would that price be? The hermit's words echoed in her mind, a warning and a challenge. The darkness could not be banished entirely, only managed, and the choices she made from now on would determine her fate. Would she have the strength to face it again when the time came, or would she be consumed, lost to the shadows that now followed her every step? As the first rays of sunlight pierced the gloom, Selene felt a fleeting sense of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to keep the darkness at bay. But as quickly as it came, the feeling was gone, replaced by the cold certainty that the spirits had not finished with her. There were still questions left unanswered, mysteries that lingered like the fog beyond her door. And as she looked once more at the forest, she knew that the story was far from over. What do you think lies ahead for Selene? Will she find a way to escape the darkness, or is she doomed to face the spirits once more? Leave your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales of mystery and terror. This is just the beginning. There are secrets in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered, and we will be here to reveal them together. The circle may be unbroken for now, but the darkness never truly leaves. It only waits.